World History students, here I am again in my home for Lesson 5 in World History from our Stay at Home, Do Our Work at Home lesson plan. I hope everyone's doing well. I hope everyone had a good Easter. And I'm ready to teach you some more. Now, we've been spending so much time in England that I've neglected one other really important part of Europe in this time period, and that is France. What the heck's going on in France right now? Well, in England, we talked about the English Civil War. In France, between the years of 1562 to 1589, there were 9 different civil wars that were raging in France. Now, the big reason for this civil war wasn't who gets to be king. It was over religion. These wars were known as the religious wars. And the king of France was always a Catholic. But we know that the Reformation started back with Martin Luther. And in France, there were a group of Protestants that were growing in numbers, and they were called Huguenots. Now, for quite a few years, the French throne had been held by a family known as the Valois, and they had a dynasty that had been running for quite a few years. Within that family, the king had some cousins that were both kind of jockeying into position to see if they could be the next people to hold the throne. There was one group of cousins known as the House of Bourbon. And there was another group known as the House of Guise. Both of them felt like they had a pretty good position in working their way up to being the next king or queen of France. But the biggest distinction between these two houses was that the Bourbons were practicing the Huguenot religion, and the Guise family were very, very loyal and devoted Catholics. The Valois king at this time period was named King Henri. It looks like Henry, but it's pronounced Henri because it's a ridiculous French accent. Henri was the king, and his queen was Catherine. Now, Catherine was lucky to be the queen of France because she had no royal blood in her veins, but she was from a very, very wealthy and influential family, one that we spoke of back when we talked about the Renaissance. She was a Medici. Now, you know your family has got a lot of power and influence if they can get you married to a king. Henri and Catherine had 3 sons together. Henri had had a mistress his whole life. Ever since he was a teenager, he had an affair with his tutor, a really beautiful woman. But he got married to Catherine, and they got busy, and they had 3 sons. Now, all of them would be in line for the throne, with the first, Francis, being the next one to be in line for the king. Henri loved athletic events, and his favorite sport of all was jousting. Jousting was a very dangerous sport, and Henri always had trouble finding people to joust against him because he was the king. No one wanted to be responsible for ever hurting the king. But he still insisted on going to jousting tournaments, even against the wishes of his wife and from a very, very famous soothsayer, a man from France known as Nostradamus. Nostradamus will go down in history as one of the greatest fortune tellers who ever lived. He even foretold the 9/11 attack in New York City that long ago. Nostradamus warned Henri. He said, "You should stop jousting. It will be the end of your life." But Henri ignored Nostradamus and went on and had his tournaments. At one particular tournament, while he was jousting, the riders came up next to each other and their lances splintered apart. The slit in Henri's visor was wide enough to have a splinter go in through the slit. It went in through his left eye, went through his brain, and came out his right ear. Henri didn't die immediately. He hung on for a day or two, and while he was in bed, he moaned and groaned and kept calling out a woman's name. It wasn't his wife's name. It was his lover's name. but he soon passed away, and the throne went to his firstborn son, Francis, who at that time was 15 years old. Francis had already been betrothed to Mary, Queen of Scots. Sadly, within a year, Francis had gotten really sick and he died. And not many people know exactly what the cause of his death was. Some people think it was of an ear infection, and some people think it was meningitis. The throne then passed on to Francis's little brother, Charles IX, who became king when he was about 10 years old. He ruled for almost 20 years, and while he was king, the civil war between the Catholics and the Huguenots really was heating up. There was a lot of bloodshed. Charles decided we need to put some kind of closure. We need to kind of mend these two sides together. So Charles made a very valiant offer. He actually forced his little sister, whose name was Marguerite, to marry one of the Huguenots. His name was Henri of Navarre. He was a Huguenot. Marguerite was a Catholic. Maybe the many of these two people together would end the Civil War. But alas, it was just a ploy. Charles's mother, the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, had a plan. The Medicis had quite a reputation for being these evil, plotting people who were able to make their enemies disappear. Catherine was an expert at poisoning. One of her favorite things to do was, if there was someone she didn't like, she would give them gifts that were laced with poison. One of her favorite was gloves. Gloves were so popular back then. Men, women, all wore gloves for many different occasions. And she would lace the insides of gloves with arsenic. And you would wear the gloves, and your sweat would activate the arsenic, and it would seep in through your skin. And you, unbeknownst to you, you would start to feel sick, and within a few days, you were dead. Now, Catherine's new plan wasn't quite that subtle. She knew that the marriage of her daughter Marguerite to this Bourbon man, this guy who was one of the leaders of the Huguenots, Henri of Navarre, would bring all kinds of Huguenot leaders to Paris for this royal wedding. And a few nights later, on August the 24th of 1572, Catherine and her son, King Charles, sent their troops out to all the places that these Huguenot guests were staying, and they pulled the people out of their rooms and slaughtered them in the streets. This was known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, because it happened to fall on St. Bartholomew's birthday. It really shouldn't be known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, because after that first night, they were so successful at eliminating Huguenots, they went on for another night, and then another night, and then another night. After about 2 weeks, they had murdered somewhere about 12,000 Huguenots. Thinking this would be the end of the Civil War was kind of a bad idea. Charles didn't live much longer. He got a lung disease known as TB, tuberculosis, and he passed away before he had any children. So the throne went on to the younger brother, who went on to become King Henri III, another Valois king. While King Henri was sitting on the throne, he was trying to patch things together in France between the Catholics and the Huguenots. On one fateful day, Henri was in his palace, and a monk came up to him and said, "Your Majesty, I have some important documents for you." And so Henri went up and took the documents from this monk's hand. And while his hands were full, the monk reached into his robe and had a knife and stuck it right up under Henri's ribs and stabbed him in the heart. Killed him on the spot. Now there are no more sons to take the throne. So this fella, Henri of Navarre, who was married to Princess Marguerite, the daughter of the last king, says, "I'm in line to be the next king." Now they weren't just going to give him the throne, so he put together an army and marched up to Paris and conquered the city of Paris, and he became the next King of France, and he is known as King Henri the Fourth. He's the first king of a brand new dynasty known as the Bourbon Dynasty because, like I wrote up here before, he is a Bourbon. Now, Henri became king at a really terrible time in French history. The country had been ravaged by civil war between Catholics and Huguenots, and he really, in his heart, wanted to patch this country back together again. So he did two really big things. The first thing he did to make the Catholics happy, since he was a Huguenot, is he said, I am going to convert to Catholic to keep you guys happy. Then, to make the Huguenots happy, he passed an edict. Remember, an edict is a royal decree. It was called the Edict of Nantes. That's a city in northern France, and that's where he was when he proclaimed this edict. And this edict says, from now on, Huguenots may worship throughout France as freely as the Catholics. There will be no more persecutions. There will be no more St. Bartholomew's Day massacres. You guys can have the same freedom the Catholics have. Now, Henri thought he would make everyone in France happy. He was wrong. The Huguenots didn't trust him anymore because he had left their religion and converted to Catholicism. And the Catholics didn't trust him because he used to be a Huguenot and now he made their enemies legit. So there was an assassination attempt on Henri's life, but it failed. Then there was another, and it failed. Then there was another. Luckily, it failed again. Henri felt very, very scared for his life. Henri felt it was necessary for him to recruit the best bodyguards he could find in all of France. And the weapon of choice at that time period was something called a musket, something that fired one shot at a time and had to be reloaded. So he scoured the countryside, finding the greatest marksmen of that time period, and he gathered around the 100 best that he could find, and they were known as the Musketeers. Now, we always think of the Musketeers as being great swordsmen. Well, they were, because the musket only had one shot. So, they had to have a secondary weapon. And the sword at that time was a very personal weapon. If you were up close trying to assassinate the king, you better be pretty good with a sword as well. And these Musketeers were excellent bodyguards. They followed him everywhere he went, from the moment he woke up in the morning till he went to bed at night, and they guarded him 100% of the time. Now, we always think of the Musketeers as three Musketeers, but that was just because it was a novel written by Alexandre Dumas that talked about three specific Musketeers. But he had enough to guard him all the time. And it's a good thing, too, because there were more assassination attempts on Henri's life. In fact, he had 26 assassination attempts on his life. Unfortunately for him, his unlucky number was 27. Because Henri met his fate one day when he jumped into his carriage. The Musketeers were riding the carriage and on the sides, and as he was leaving his palace grounds, there was a man in the bushes named Ravaillac. And Ravaillac hated the king, and just as the carriage was picking up speed, he dove through the carriage window and pulled out a knife and stabbed Henri to death. Ravaillac was caught and put on trial, and he was found guilty of regicide, which means the killing of a king. And he was sentenced to death. But it was an interesting death. They took Ravaillac and they tied a rope to this arm and to this arm and to this leg and to this leg and attached those ropes to 4 different horses and said, "Giddy up!" And he was pulled apart by all the horses. And that was the end of his life. And on that happy note, we're going to end our lesson today. And I will have another one for you later this week. Thanks so much.